So apologies, the intro for this is obviously a little different. With where I have this in my shop, it was cast in shadows if I had the camera far enough back to get myself in the whole piece in the frame. So it's gonna have to just be a standalone kind of close up. You can see I'm pretty much done with this. There's some touch-ups to be done, but this is essentially the piece. I did end up using a hard wax finish on this. In general, I did like it. I'll talk about it more in the video, but this is the finished piece, and I'll put some photos up at the end. The photos show up a little bit better with where I have it in my shop with the lighting to get a full view of what it looks like. So to start this off, I wanted to do the intersecting X for the wine rack. Now if this was a square box, it's a lot easier. You can usually just make a cross and then turn it on edge and it will fit in there. But this box was a rectangle, so I made a template to start with so I knew what angle I needed, and I just used the back side of the backer so I could draw on it and you would never see it in order to get those original angles. From that template I got the angle I needed. I could set that up on my table saw, and this is going to be lapped together, so I'm going halfway through the piece. I'm cutting both of these identically because you could just flip it and they'll fit together. You don't have to flip the fence or anything to make these cuts. So you can see I'm going about halfway down. Now I'm stopping early because if you go all the way through, you'll get a little bit of a curve cut because the blade is circular. But then I just slid the fence over and cut the other side as well. So then I would chisel out the rest of this. It's not much to chisel. And it looks like I'm cutting off my marks on this second piece, but the marks were in the wrong spot. So there's my piece. I could use a saw to just finish those cuts using the original cuts as a rough guide. And then since this is plywood, I could just go through and chisel out those bits. So I just made a stop cut at the bottom of this plywood, and then I could chisel out those parts. The hardest part of this was just figuring out the math and the angles in order to get it. Once that was done, fitting this together, this is the first test fit, and it pretty much fit together nice and snug right from the beginning. You can see I'm trying to film and hammer it together, but it's a nice tight fit. And then I could slide it into place and check the fit. It fit in there nicely. So what I decided to do, instead of angling out the corners so that it fit inside the box, was to put a face frame basically on the front of this piece. So you can see how there's a little gap in between where it hits the edges. So the original template I made had those corners cut out, so I just copied from the template those corners, and then I lap jointed the middles, which was pretty easy to do because I just lined it up with the plywood box so I could get those angles again. And then this is the thin face frame that's going in the front. So then the bottom is going to be a drawer. I'm using bottom mount slides, so basically this is just the rough math for that. I have my opening, and then you subtract depending on the thickness of your plywood, and then the plywood on the sides. I'm using 3/4 because this is usually what I have around in the shop. You could get away with 1/2 inch or usually 5/8 for stuff like this. So I was just able to make this fit on my router template for doing dovetails, which was nice because it's just the easiest way to do this. So this box is a little over 11 inches tall, and after I removed the little other side of the jig has alignment pins as well. I was able to remove those and then fit this whole piece in there. So I always do a test piece with this jig because plywood's all different thicknesses, especially today. You might go buy a piece that's 23-30 seconds, and then the next time you'll buy a piece that's 3/4. So there's always micro adjustments to be made on this, so I always do a test piece first. But with one drawer, it's pretty quick work. So this is getting those Blum undermount slides, and you have to put a groove a 1/2 inch up on the bottom, which is clearance for the slides. And then on the back, I like to rabbet the back in place. So on the back side of those sides, I'm just putting a rabbet groove. Just gives you a little more gluing surface for the drawers. The important joint is in the front because that's where all of the force will be when you open the drawer, is that front joint. And then I could dry fit this together, measure and cut my insert, which you see in place, which is 1/2 inch plywood. Once again, that's what I had. This is also a pretty big drawer, so I wanted something sturdy on the bottom, and then I could glue this all into place. And the nice thing about these dovetails is the drawer really aligns itself when you have these solid sorts of joints. I always check for diagonal. There's usually a little bit of a micro adjustment to do. And then to dry, I like to just put the drawer inside where it's going to go, fit it into place, and with it in place, I know that it will be square and dry up. Don't need a lot of clamps on those dovetail ones because they fit together pretty snugly as is. So then for the front, I cut out the piece. I used blue tape on this one just because this walnut veneer chips so easily, even with nice finishing blades on there. I double-sided taped it into place, and then I just marked where it goes with a pencil, and then I could pull off the front. I have the pencil marks on there. I could take the drawer out, and then I could just screw the face to the drawer by realigning it with those pencil marks. I used to glue these in place. Now plywood, it probably wouldn't be an issue, but if you're using a hardwood as your face and you're gluing it to a plywood box, I have had problems with that in the past because the hardwood would move and the plywood doesn't, and it could make the box bow. So I don't glue these on there anymore. And then that's how that fits. This drawer fit perfectly the first time around. I didn't have hardly any adjustments to do. So the front pull I'm also making, it's just going to be a slight taper. I made these on a piece a couple months ago. I didn't leave myself a ton of room for screwing it into the cabinet. So on this one I made sure I left a substantial amount of material there so I had enough to screw into. So you can see I'm doing the first curve cuts down the side, then I could flip it on edge and remove that little shim of wood. This I was basically working off of a photo for this. Now I could cut the angled parts on the table saw, but sometimes I just like to hand plane stuff like this. So I had a couple little planes and I just planed down the angles on that. I pre-drilled 2 holes, and then I could pop open the drawer because you're going through 1.5 inch material here. So I pre-drilled both holes. And then I could countersink them from the back end to hide those screw heads, and then I could attach that. I put a clamp on there, and then I could attach the pull. This is pretty easy lining that up. This is just two inch screws that go into this. And then I could remove the little piece of tape I had on there to help open it and close it. And then for attaching that face frame, I didn't want to put any brads in this because I'd just have to fill them. So this is a very snug fit as well. So I just put it in place and then I taped it on there. And the painter's tape will hold stuff like this. Painter tape will not work as well as clamps, so you need a pretty nice fit already. But it's strong enough to hold everything in place as the glue dries. Now for the finished, I use Rubio Monocoat. People have told me about it before. I also want to try Osmo and Odie's oil, but this is the one I wanted to try first, also based on the recommendations I got, and I believe it was the first video. So I watched a lot of YouTube videos about how people apply this stuff, and something I usually don't do is what I'm doing for this, because it was recommended, was to raise the grain on the piece. So the water will go on there and raise the grain almost like goosebumps on the wood. I usually don't do this when I'm using wiping varnish, just because I always sand in between coats on wiping varnish, because in my shop there's always dust getting into the finish. So if I raise the grain before I put on the wiping varnish, it's just an extra step. But because Rubio is one coat, if you don't raise the grain, you'll have to do it after you apply that first coat. So I raised the grain, I sanded to 150, even though I've heard people say 180, but 150 is what I had in the shop. And then I used some paint thinner to remove all of that dust. So this is just everything drying with that paint thinner on it. So I got these white pads, which I use for other finishes to apply the finish. I use this for wiping varnish as well. It's just kind of an easier version of a steel wool pad. So there's the Rubio and basic 3-to-1 mixture. The thing I liked about this is you don't have to use the hardener in order for this to work, and I noticed as I was using it, it really smelled like linseed oil, which would make sense because it's an oil finish, and linseed oil takes a while to cure. So I don't believe there's anywhere online that tells you exactly what's in it. There might be, but I distinctly smell linseed oil, which must be in there, which is also nice because I do love a linseed oil finish. It's not super sturdy by its own, so it's nice that they kind of made it a little more durable with this. And then I applied the first coat with that white pad, and then I go through and buff it with these blue pads and remove most of the finish. This finish is kind of like stain. If you don't remove all of the finish, it won't really dry. Flat surfaces I found much easier to apply the finish versus vertical surfaces and smaller surfaces, and buffing was also much easier. Now when this came, and this is not the company's fault, I thought by the description online, the photos, I visually was looking at the photos, it looked like a quart of this stuff is what you order, but it's really only a little bit more than a pint. So I was making this first coat, I was stretching it pretty far, and in doing that I had to put a second coat on. If I would have ordered 2, I could have put it on pretty thick. Some finishes you could get away with stretching, this one you cannot, and it definitely left some bald spots on the finish. So in between the first and the second coat, I'm just using some water with a little bit of soap in it, and then the same white pads in order to buff out the finish. This also left it extremely smooth, and then I could go through and apply the second coat. So that admittedly was my own fault. I truly think this probably is a Monocoat system if you put on the proper amount in the beginning. I let this dry for 24 hours, and then I could start putting everything back together. Now I thought I filmed it, but I didn't. On the inside of these cabinets, they're screwed into the frame to sturdy up this whole piece. Now Rubio also sells an oil that can go on top of this. I didn't buy it because it's also pretty expensive. I like the Rubio a lot, but it is a huge price difference, especially if you quote out furniture. It's easily twice as much money as a Waterlox finish, and even a little bit more than a General Finishes Armor Seal, which I also like to use. On a bigger piece, the cost would just be pretty exorbitant, but I do like it. It will be interesting to see how it holds up. It seems pretty sturdy on its own, and the fact that it does go on in one finish is a nice trade-off for the cost, because something like this would usually take me 5 or 6 days, as well as cure time, in order to get it on the piece, whereas with this, if I did it properly, it would have been a day. So I still want to try out some of the other finishes and see what they look like, but my initial reaction from using the Rubio was I did really like it. It really made the walnut pop, probably the most. The only other finish I've had walnut pop like this is a tongue oil finish I do really like as well, but once again the problem is it's not as durable, but it really made the walnut super vibrant and very saturated looking as far as the color.